We have a very daring and skillful opponent against us, and may I say, across the havoc of war, a great general. That was said by Winston Churchill regarding Erwin Rommel in 1942.
Hi everyone, I'm Louis. I'm joined with my friend Harry, part of the Are You Bored Yet podcast. This is, I believe, episode 3. I'll pass over to Harry and he'll explain what he's doing.
So, on today's episode we are talking about North Africa and the Japanese Empire, and I hate to say it, we did neglect talking about the Japanese Empire the past 2 episodes, so I thought I would start it off now. In 1904 to 1905, the Japanese actually won a great war against the Russians, the Russo-Japanese War. It led to obviously a Japanese victory, and it was a turning point in the world. People could actually see Japan being on the world stage, as prior to that, for the past few hundred years, Japan had been a very sort of hermit kingdom. No one really knew what went on there. There was only a few people that ever were able to visit Japan and stuff like that. So for Japan to be able to beat the largest country in the world in a ground battle was absolutely insane. And then during World War One, the Japanese were actually on our side helping fight against German colonies and other aggressors in Asia. But fast forward to the 1930s, Japan is run by an empire, as you should know. The emperor is Emperor Hirohito. His people saw him as a living god, right? And that led to a few issues later on down the line when they started using kamikaze pilots, kamikaze soldiers, but that is a topic for another time. During the 1930s, there was still many border clashes with the Russians, and that carried on quite a while. But in 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, which is the bit just above Japanese-controlled Korea. They occupied that, and they began expanding into northern China. And on July 7th, 1937, there was something called the Marco Polo Bridge incident. Due to this clash at the bridge, it led to the Second Sino-Japanese War. And then fast forward a few months later, to December 12th, 1937, you had something called the USS Panay incident. So Japan bombed the ship USS Panay. 3 Americans were killed and an undisclosed amount of Chinese civilians were killed. The Japanese claimed it was an accident, but reports on the ground saw that Japanese aircraft flew low enough that people could see the pilots. Was it an accident? I think we'll never know. That is another of history that has just, well, been lost to history. The initial invasion of China was designed to be a swift takeover of the rest of the country. However, that did not happen. It led to a brutal quagmire, and the war carried on all the way up into the 1940s, up until the surrender of the Japanese in August of 1945. There was many atrocities committed in China, such as Nanjing. I apologise for that pronunciation. That was a complete massacre, and due to other circumstances in World War II, like the Holocaust, or maybe even Unit 731, many people don't understand about the massacre in Nanjing. It was brutal. I suggest doing some own research on that, as if we get talking about it, we will get in trouble by YouTube. I think that briefly covers what went on in the 1930s for Japan, and throughout the late 30s, early 40s, Japan began to expand ever eastwards towards the islands that are controlled by the United States. They knew that they would end up in a conflict with the United States at some point, and the United States actually owned their own sort of unofficial empire in the Pacific, and they were all very for anti-imperialism, but they owned quite a bit of land. So, December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor happened. That is another separate series on its own battle. A US Pacific Fleet was meant to be knocked out by the Japanese carrier strike groups in the region. Luckily, the US carriers were out on an exercise at the time and were not affected by it.
Since
And that's
the
what brought the United
unprovoked
States into the war.
and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Si scioglie la nebbia la brina, quei furbi inglesi che pernottano in cantina, tra sciarpe e bottiglie, succhiando pastiglie, domandano ai topi quando il tempo cambierà. April non giunge con vol di colombe, lancia dai cieli piogge di bombe, lancia siluri, fa colpi sicuri, e l'aprile d'Italia che gloria ci va, percossa sconvolta.
So then, Louis, let's look towards North Africa. Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
We're a year into the war, and Italy had a plan to seize Egypt. British-controlled Egypt. Their objectives was to seize Egypt, capture the Suez Canal, cut off Britain from other colonies, like India and Asian colonies, from supplies, etc., etc., and dominate the Med, or the Mediterranean. Mussolini turned over to his marshal, Rodolfo Graziani. So it was the Italian 10th Army, and it was his plan to invade Egypt from Italian Libya. So the Italian strength on the field was 150,000 men, 1,600 artillery pieces, and 600 tanks. Specifically, I believe they were L3 tankettes, which weren't that good. But the problem is, it wasn't just quality of things, it was more so quantity. You see, because they had a very limited motor transport, as well as very weak air-space coordination and supremacy over Great Britain. They proved themselves many times the British. The invasion happened on the 13th of September 1940. The Italian 10th Army, they advanced around 60 miles. They advanced to Sidi Bourani. However, they stopped to build fortified camps instead of pushing up to Alexandria, which is a very, very key naval base held by the British. This was their biggest mistake. If they kept moving up to Alexandria and captured that naval base, Hitler's opinion on Mussolini would have changed. Moving on from that, that was probably the biggest turning point for Africa for the Italians. So, Operation Compass occurred on December the 9th, which was pretty much a British counterattack to repel the Italian forces. So, the British commander was General Archibald Wavell. He had, at his dispense, 36,000 troops, which consisted of the Commonwealth, British, Indian and Australian. So this consisted especially of the Indian 4th Infantry and the 7th Royal Tank Regiment. So this resulted in a British victory, as it overran the Miletti group, which is their commander, or Pietro Miletti, was actually killed in the counterattack, which is quite a big thing for the Italians. The casualty figures were crazy. British, 56 casualties, 27 tanks, which they were Matilda 2, whereas the Italians were, and the Libyans, 119 were killed. 1,300 were wounded, and 2,000 were captured. So, bit after, next year, January 3rd, 1941, the Battle of Bardia. Massive naval and aerial bombardments happened by the RAF and the Royal Navy, which is Kriegsmarine knows, are a pain in the neck. The Australian 6th Division, supported by 23 of the Matilda 2 tanks and artillery, which supported them. Italian tanks were, let's think of a word. Can you think of a word about
Shocking.
this? Yeah, shocking.
I can think of some other words as well, but I don't think we're allowed to say them.
Yeah, shocking. Fast.
First tank, they were very quick, very light, but the L333 lacked no armour.
Yeah.
It had no armour, right? L333, and its the initial variant had barely any firepower to compete against British tanks such as the Crusader and Matilda 2, which could very much outclass them.
The Australian 6th Division, supported by 23 Matilda 2s, tanks and artillery, they attacked the fortified town of Bardia in Libya. This crippled the Italian 10th Army. Crippled them. As you can see from the casualty figures I'm about to read out, the British lost around 450 men. The Italians, 40,000 of them were captured. That is crazy. That is actually crazy. So yeah, that was the Battle of Bardia. Huge part of Operation Compass. The capture of Tobruk, not the siege, the capture. So this was January 21st, which is a few weeks after the Battle of Bardia. The 6th Division, again, launched assault on the Italian stronghold of Tobruk in Libya. Italian troops consisted of 25,000 men. I can't find a good figure. I've looked everywhere for different sources, and the sources that tell me are that it was 25,000 men. I could be wrong, I could be right, I don't know. But yeah, 24,000 to 30,000 men were either killed or wounded or captured by British Commonwealth forces. That was the Axis losses. The Allied losses, however, the Western Desert Force, 400 men were killed, wounded or captured. 355 of those were Australians, as well as 208 artillery pieces and 87 tanks were captured by the British from the Italians. The Battle of Bida Farm, which was a month later, it was the 5th of February 1941. This is the final battle of Operation Compass, I believe. The British armoured units cutting off retreating Italian 10th units. So just pretty much this was to just scurry the rest of the Italian forces and just kick them out of the place. This ended the Italians' presence in Cyrenaica. So yeah, that was a very key part of how this I've just shown you how bad the Italian planning was. This is when the main fighting force, this is when the big change, well, I say big change, the Afrika Corps arrived, 1941. Adolf Hitler sends Erwin Rommel, a legendary World War I lieutenant. He was sent to Libya to prevent the Italian collapse. So the Afrika Corps, they arrived in February 1941. They consisted of 45,000 German soldiers, 150 to 250 modern German Panzer tanks, which were the Panzer 3s and 4s, which were 10 times better than the Italian counterparts. Yeah, the Panzer 3s and 4s, they were a lot better than Italian counterparts, and they actually probably better quality than the British, hence why we had more of them, and we didn't seem to care when we lost more of them. So pretty much, Rommel arrived. This is when Operation Sonnenblume occurred, or Sunflower occurred. This is 24th of March 1941, which was Rommel. He launched an offensive earlier than he was supposed to, as Hitler and his high command wanted Rommel to launch the attack mid-summer, late summer. However, they captured major parts such as the Alagala, Mezzabriga, Asdabia, and Benghazi, which was the 4th of April 1941. The British retreat was chaotic, as you guessed it, they didn't see that coming. So, the big one, the Siege of Tobruk, the 10th of April. This one lasted a couple of months. 10th of April to 27th of November 1941. The Allied garrisons consisted of 35,000 troops. They were mostly consisted of the Australian 9th Division, but they were later supplied with Polish and English troops. And the Axis consisted of 100,000 German and Italian men, so the Germans were heavily outnumbering, the Axis were heavily outnumbering the British in this part. So, go on to the losses, which is the big part. Although they had 70,000 more men than the Allies, the Axis had 8,000 to 10,000 casualties. So did the British and the Commonwealth. They lost 3,000 men and the 7,000 were wounded, so around the same numbers for both sides. Tobruk actually held off the Axis because of, you guessed it, Harry, who held them off?
The good old Royal Navy.
Yes, and as I was saying before, the losses were pretty much the same, even though the Axis heavily outnumbered them. Tobruk actually prevented Rommel from fully advancing into Egypt. Operation Battle Axe. This was the summer of 1941, 15th of June. This was the British plan to retake eastern Cyrenaica from the Axis powers. This was the first time in the war that a large German force was actually fought into a defensive, which is crazy. So the British consisted of 190 tanks with 28,000 men. The Axis powers had 100 tanks with around 13 to 14,000 men. This was when the Crusaders and the Matilda IIs were on a heavy use here, and the Panzer 3s and 4s were on a heavy use as well. However, this was a major failure for the British and Commonwealth forces. So before I do read out the losses, this battle actually changed the leadership. General Wavell was replaced by a chap called Claude Auchinleck. He was also, I believe, a very respectable gentleman from World War I. British losses consisted of 122 killed, 588 wounded, and 259 men missing, including 33 fighters and 3 bombers destroyed or disabled. German and Italian losses were around 1,100 men in total, which 235 men were missing. Next operation, Operation Crusader. The British objective to relieve Tobruk, destroy all the Axis armour left from Rommel and the Italian commander and the leadership, and to recapture Cyrenaica. Major battles included were the Battle of Sidi Rezgh, which was November 1941, the Battle of El Duda and Bir el Gubi. So the Allied men consisted of 118,000 with 738 tanks, which is crazy. This was nearly double the Axis power tanks, as the Axis had 119,000 men, which was the German and Italian forces, with 390 tanks. So the losses, a bit surprising. Allies, they lost 17,700 men, casualties, with 278 tanks destroyed. The Germans lost 340 of their tanks out of 390, either disabled or destroyed. 38,000 men fell to the British wrath. The outcome was Tobruk was relieved on the 27th of November 1941. The Axis retreated to El Agheila, and the front was stabilised again. So that was North Africa for 1941. I would explain 1942, but that was a different subject, and it would take me years and years and years to explain it all to you, because you can go on rambling for hours. That was North Africa for 1941. We'll do East Africa soon.
Yeah, I think we'll carry on with the North Africa campaign throughout the years in our later episodes. So, like we said, that brought it to 1941. We'll discuss the eventual downfall of the German Afrika Korps and the Italian forces in Libya and Rommel's last stand at Tunisia. We'll discuss all that later on.
Yeah, that was my North Africa bit of 1941, not 42. I'll explain El Alamein in 42, 1 and 2. But yeah, we'll do 1942, and I believe we'll do 1942 and Eastern Africa in the same episode. I think we could do. That'd be a good thing. So yeah, that was my bit of North Africa.
Yeah, I think we're done.